The day Daniel Carr walked into my conference room, he was wearing a navy suit I didn't recognize and a confident smile I absolutely did. He stepped through the glass door of the 14th floor interview suite at Callaway Partners, smoothed his jacket, looked at the three people seated at the table, and then he saw me. The smile didn't disappear immediately. It took about 2 full seconds. I watched it happen the way you watch a building's lights go out floor by floor, top to bottom, then nothing. I had been waiting for that moment since the morning his resume crossed my desk 6 days earlier. I hadn't planned to be in the room. I was the director of talent acquisition at Callaway Partners. I didn't typically sit in on final round interviews for senior operations candidates. But when I saw the name at the top of that resume, I made an exception. I had last spoken to Daniel Carr 7 years, 3 months, and 11 days ago, standing in a parking lot outside a Marriott in downtown Hartford, in a rehearsal dinner dress I'd bought on sale and altered myself, while he told me he didn't think we were right for each other. 3 weeks before our wedding. He said it quietly, like he was delivering a verdict he had prepared in advance. I stood there holding a glass of sparkling water I hadn't touched, and felt the ground rearrange itself under my feet. He was gone before I finished my next sentence. 7 years later, he needed a job. I was the person deciding whether he got one. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Now let me take you back. Not 7 years, further than that. Let me take you back to the beginning, because if you want to understand what was sitting across that conference table from Daniel Carr on a Thursday morning in March, you need to understand who built her. My name is Nadia Voss. I'm 34 years old. I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Bridgeport, Connecticut. My mother, Rosaria, a home health aide who worked 12-hour shifts and still somehow had dinner on the table by 7. My father left when I was 9. No drama, no big scene, he just stopped coming home one Thursday and eventually my mother stopped waiting. She never talked about it. She just worked harder. That's where I learned it, not from a mentor, not from a book, from watching a woman who had every reason to stop choose not to. I was the first person in my family to graduate from college. The second to earn a master's degree. The first was my mother's younger brother, who got his education the same year I got mine in organizational psychology from UConn. I tell you this not for sympathy, but for context. Because when Daniel Carr's mother, Patricia, sat across from me at a dinner in their home in Westport 3 weeks after Daniel and I got engaged, and asked me where my family summered, I understood exactly what that question was designed to do. I didn't have a summer place. I had a mother who worked weekends. And Patricia Carr knew that before she asked. I met Daniel at a networking event when I was 25. He worked in operations management at his family's logistics firm, a mid-size company his grandfather had started in the 70s and his father had grown into something respectable. He was charming the way people are charming when they've been taught to be: handshakes, eye contact, the right questions. He asked about my work before he asked anything personal, which at 25 I took as a sign of character rather than strategy. We dated for 2 years. He introduced me to his parents at the 11-month mark, which in retrospect should have told me something. Patricia Carr was not a cruel woman. I want to be precise about that. She was not the kind of person who said ugly things out loud. She was the kind of person who made you feel ugly through very polite, very pointed observation. At that first dinner in Westport, she asked where my family summered. At the second, at Christmas, she asked if I was planning to do something with my hair before the holidays. At the third, when I mentioned my promotion to senior coordinator at the HR consulting firm where I worked, she said, "How wonderful for someone your age." Not my age. Someone my age. I was 27. I ate my dinner, cleared my plate, and told Daniel afterward in the car that his mother didn't like me. He said I was reading into things. He said with time she'd come around. He said it the way people say things they don't believe but need you to believe so they can go on believing it themselves. The engagement happened on a Tuesday evening in April. We were in my apartment, takeout containers on the coffee table, and he pulled out a ring he'd been carrying in his coat pocket for what he later told me was 3 weeks. The ring was beautiful. Simple, elegant, a thin gold band with a single oval diamond. I cried. He held my face in both hands. I still remember the exact feeling of that, his palms warm against my jaw, his eyes saying something that looked like certainty. We set the date for 14 months out. A Saturday in October. I found the venue in May, a restored farmhouse in Simsbury that was within our budget if we kept the guest list to 120 and chose the mid-tier catering package. I built a spreadsheet. I researched florists. I made calls on my lunch break and sent confirmation emails before 7 in the morning. My mother was so happy she cried every time we talked about it. She had already bought her dress. Then came the summer before the wedding, and that was when Patricia Carr's quiet disapproval shifted into something more deliberate. She started calling Daniel more frequently. Not to talk to both of us, specifically to talk to him, which meant I started to see him less. She organized a family dinner in July and my invitation came through Daniel 2 days before, as an afterthought, when the rest of his family had known for 3 weeks. I went because I was still trying. At that dinner, she introduced me to her friend Helen as Daniel's friend from work. I corrected her gently. Actually, we met at a networking event. I'm his fiancé. Patricia smiled. Of course. I always mix those things up. She didn't mix them up. I knew that even then. But I sat down because Daniel was watching me from across the table with that expression he had, the one that said please just let it go, please don't make this harder. And I let it go because I loved him. Because I thought love was supposed to make room for discomfort. Because I hadn't yet learned that there's a difference between making room for discomfort and making yourself disappear. The first week of September, 10 weeks before the wedding, Daniel told me he needed more time. Not more time before the ceremony, more time in general. He said he'd been feeling overwhelmed. That the pressure of the wedding planning had gotten to him. I rearranged my entire work schedule to take more of the logistics off his plate. I thought he meant logistics. I didn't understand that more time was the first draft of what he actually meant, and that he was working up to the final version. He delivered it on a Friday evening in October, 3 weeks before the date. We were supposed to be attending the rehearsal dinner walkthrough at the farmhouse in Simsbury. We never made it. He called me from the parking lot of the venue and asked me to come outside. I came outside. He was already standing by his car, wearing a gray sport coat I'd helped him pick out. He had both hands in his pockets. He looked like someone who had rehearsed what he was going to say many times and still didn't know how to say it. He told me he'd been thinking, and that he didn't believe they were right for each other. He used the word they. Not we. I noticed that. They meant he'd already made the separation in his own mind. He said he didn't think I would be happy in the life his family expected him to live. He said his mother had concerns. He said he hoped I would understand. I stood there in a rehearsal dinner dress I'd altered myself because the alteration shop was $80 and I was still paying down my student loans, and I understood 3 things simultaneously. That he was not ending our engagement because I wasn't good enough. He was ending it because his mother had decided that, and because he had chosen her decision over me. That the word I was looking for was not heartbreak, it was clarity. And that I was never going to let a man look at me like that again, like I was a thing he had outgrown rather than a person he had chosen. He left before I finished my next sentence. I stood in that parking lot for 11 minutes. I know because I checked the time when I walked out and again when I got back to my car. Then I drove home, sat on my bathroom floor for about an hour, and the following Monday morning I went to work. The next 6 months were the cleanest kind of difficult, not complicated grief, just hard work. I called the farmhouse in Simsbury and asked about the cancellation policy. I lost the deposit, $2,400, which was everything I had in savings outside my emergency fund. I called all 112 guests myself. Not a form email, I called each person because they had spent time and money planning to be there, and that deserved a real conversation. My mother asked me twice if I was okay. I told her I was. The third time she asked, I said I will be, which was more honest. She flew up from Bridgeport on a Saturday, brought pastels, and sat on my couch until I fell asleep. She didn't try to fix it. She just stayed. I have never appreciated anything more in my life. Daniel got engaged 11 months later to a woman named Courtney Bellingham. Old Westport family. Parents who summered in Nantucket. A law degree from Georgetown. I know this because LinkedIn exists and sometimes you look up things you know aren't good for you, the way you press on a bruise just to confirm it still hurts. I looked once, noted the information, felt the familiar rearrangement of the ground beneath my feet, and then put my phone down and registered for the GMAT. I had been thinking about an MBA for 2 years. I stopped thinking about it and started doing it. I got into UConn's School of Business. Not a reach school, a solid program I could afford while working full-time. I graduated 2.5 years later with a 3.9 GPA and a specialty in organizational behavior. My mother sat in the third row in a blue dress and cried. I kept the graduation photo on my desk for 6 years. From there, the trajectory was not a rocket. It was a climb, and climbs involve footholds, not flight. I moved from HR consulting to internal talent strategy at a mid-size biotech firm. Then I spent 3 years at a regional investment advisory, building their people operations from scratch. Then Callaway Partners recruited me. Callaway was the kind of firm that people in my industry described as where careers get serious. 60 years old, offices in 7 cities, clients in finance, healthcare, and technology. The Director of Talent Acquisition role was the most competitive interview process I'd ever been through, 3 rounds, a case presentation, a panel interview with 4 senior partners. I prepared for 8 weeks. I got the offer on a Thursday afternoon and sat in my car in a parking garage and laughed for about 2 minutes straight, because it was such a specific kind of joy, the kind you feel when something you built through years of deliberate effort finally holds your weight. That was 14 months before Daniel Carr's resume landed in my inbox. His name came through on a Wednesday morning in early March. The candidate pool for the Senior Director of Operations role had been curated by one of our external recruiting partners, Halcyon Search, a firm we used for mid to senior placements. I was reviewing the final shortlist with my team when I scrolled to the 6th candidate and stopped. Daniel Aaron Carr, 37 years old. Currently, Vice President of Operations at Carr Logistics, his family's firm. The role he wanted, Senior Director of Operations, Callaway Partners. The cover letter was polished but generic. The resume was solid but not exceptional. He had reasonable numbers from his time at the family business, but the family business had contracted significantly in the last 3 years. I could see it in the employee headcount drop across the dates, the revenue figures conspicuously absent where you'd expect them. The company was shrinking. He needed out. And there, at the bottom of the references section, a name I recognized, Thomas Whitfield, Senior Partner, Callaway Partners. Thomas was not Daniel's friend. He was a peripheral acquaintance of Daniel's father through the Hartford business community. The kind of name you put on a resume when you need something impressive and you're not sure what else to reach for. I forwarded the file to my coordinator and typed 4 words, schedule him. Final round. Then I added 3 more, I'll be in the room. My coordinator, Priya, 26, sharp, encyclopedic knowledge of our hiring process, sent back a note within the hour, sure. Do you want to lead the interview or observe? I replied, lead. She didn't question it. That was the thing about Priya. She trusted my decisions because I had never given her a reason not to. I spent the 6 days between that reply and Daniel's interview the same way I spent any preparation period, thoroughly. I reviewed the job description in detail, mapped his experience against our competency framework, identified 3 areas where his background showed clear gaps, and prepared my questions accordingly. I did not prepare anything personal. I didn't need to. Whatever had once been personal between us was 7 years old and belonged in a parking lot in Simsbury. What was going to be sitting in that conference room on Thursday morning was a candidate, and I was the interviewer, and the only thing that mattered was whether he was the right person for the role. He was not going to be the right person for the role. I had known that the moment I saw his resume. But I was going to give him the full 60 minutes to demonstrate it himself. What I had learned in the months after the breakup, through a therapist named Dr. Felicia Cole who had the patience of someone who'd heard everything twice and the precision of a diagnostician, was this: I had not been broken by Daniel Carr. I had been clarified. I understood for the first time, sitting in Dr. Cole's office in the winter after the engagement ended, that I had spent 2 years with a man who was decent in private and weak in public, and that the combination of those two things was the most dangerous kind of person to love. Because in private, he was enough. But in public, where his mother was watching and his family's expectations pressed down like a thumb on a scale, he chose them. Every time. Not dramatically, not cruelly, just quietly and consistently. He chose them. And I had stayed long enough to watch it happen repeatedly because I had confused his private decency with the kind of courage it takes to choose someone in front of the people who are telling you not to. It wasn't courage. It was comfort. And when comfort became too expensive, when choosing me would have cost him something real, he made his choice. The parking lot. The gray sport coat. The hands in his pockets. The word they instead of we. I knew, sitting in my office at Callaway Partners at 7:15 on a Thursday morning in March, that I was not bringing Daniel Carr in for vindication. I was not sitting in that interview room to make him feel small. I was there because his name had appeared on a candidate list and I was the director of talent acquisition and it was my job to assess everyone who came through that door with the same rigor I applied to anyone else. What happened after that assessment would be a result of who he was, not who I was. And that distinction mattered more to me than anything I could have scripted. At 9:58, Priya knocked on my office door. "Carr's here," she said. "Conference room B." I picked up my folder, straightened my jacket, and walked down the hall. Conference room B at Callaway Partners had floor-to-ceiling windows on one side and a long mahogany table that seated 12. We were using only one end of it. I had arranged the seating deliberately, myself at the head, flanked by Marcus Webb, our senior partner for operations, and Diane Lowe, head of strategic partnerships. Both were aware this was a final round interview. Neither knew anything else. I had not told them. Whatever was about to happen in that room would happen on its own terms, without the contamination of backstory. I was already seated when Priya opened the door and Daniel walked in. He was mid-stride when he saw me. The stride didn't falter immediately. He completed it, one full step into the room, and then it happened, that 2-second dissolve, the smile guttering out floor by floor. His hand was already extended toward the table in the reflex of someone who has entered many conference rooms and knows the choreography. It stopped mid-air. I looked at him with the same expression I give every candidate who sits across that table from me, attentive, neutral, professionally warm. "Mr. Carr," I said. "Please, sit down." Marcus and Diane exchanged a brief glance. Neither said anything. Daniel sat. He set his portfolio on the table. His hand was steady. I noted that. Whatever he was feeling, he had enough control to contain it physically. That told me something about him, not what it would have told me 7 years ago, but something. "Thank you for coming in," I said. "I'm Nadia Voss, Director of Talent Acquisition. You've already spoken with Marcus and Diane in the second round, so I'll skip the formal introductions. I'll be leading today's session. We have 60 minutes. I opened my folder. He was still looking at me with the particular expression of a person trying to calculate how much the other person knows, how much they intend to use it, and how much time they have to figure out the answer. "Let's start with your current role," I said, and clicked my pen. He started talking. The first 10 minutes were competent. He had clearly prepared. His answers about operational structure, team leadership, and process improvement were rehearsed but not hollow. There was real experience behind them, 7 years of running a mid-size logistics operation. He knew the vocabulary. He had the metrics. He delivered them with the practiced ease of a man who had been the senior person in the room for long enough that rooms stopped making him nervous. But I was watching something else. I was watching the way his eyes came back to me every third sentence, checking, recalibrating, trying to read whether I was going to use what I knew. I wasn't going to use what I knew. I was going to use what he showed me. At the 12-minute mark, I asked him the first question he hadn't prepared for. Tell me about a time when a key business decision you championed didn't perform the way you projected. Walk me through what happened and what you changed as a result. He paused. A fraction longer than he should have. We had a warehouse consolidation initiative in 2021, he said. We moved from 4 regional facilities to 2 centralized hubs. The cost modeling looked strong on paper. What were the projected savings? I asked. Approximately $800,000 annually. And actual? Another pause. We came in around $190,000 the first year. What was the gap driven by? He talked for 3 minutes. The answer was technically correct but structurally evasive. He covered the operational reasons for the shortfall without once using the word "I" in a sentence that attributed any part of the failure to a decision he had personally made. I wrote 3 words on my notepad: accountability gap, note. Marcus shifted slightly in his seat. He had heard the same thing. At the 20-minute mark, Daniel had recovered enough composure to attempt something I had not anticipated. He leaned slightly forward, hands folded on the table, and looked directly at me. Nadia, he said, first name, deliberate, a small recalibration of the dynamic. I want to acknowledge that this is an unusual situation for both of us. I wasn't expecting to see you here. That's fine, I said, my voice completely level. This is a professional setting. I evaluate every candidate on the same criteria. I don't expect the situation to be relevant. The word relevant did something to his expression. He sat back by approximately 2 inches. I had just told him, in the most precise possible language, that what had happened between us was not relevant to this room. That was not cruelty. It was accuracy. And he heard it exactly as I meant it. The next 20 minutes were where the interview found its shape. Marcus took over for a segment on cross-functional leadership, and Diane walked him through a hypothetical scenario about client-facing operations under budget pressure. Daniel performed adequately. Not poorly, adequately. He had the instincts of someone who had grown up in the business, who understood operations at a structural level, who could speak fluently about systems and people and process. But there were 3 things missing that I had identified in my pre-interview preparation and that the conversation confirmed. First, he had never operated outside his family's firm. Every example he gave, every metric, every challenge, every success, happened within the contained ecosystem of a company where his last name was on the masthead. He had never had to prove himself without that context. Second, his strategic thinking stopped at the cost optimization level. When Marcus pushed him on growth strategy, on what operations infrastructure looks like when you're scaling into new markets rather than just running existing ones, he pivoted back to efficiency language every time. He was a maintainer. Callaway needed a builder. Third, and most significant, he was interviewing for a role that would require him to operate with substantial autonomy and report directly to senior partner level. When I asked him, at the 40-minute mark, deliberately, how he managed upward, how he communicated with leadership when he disagreed with a strategic direction, he said, I try to understand the vision and align my team with it. What if you believe the vision has a material flaw? I asked. He gave me a version of the same answer with different words. I wrote one more note, differs upward, structural. At 55 minutes, I closed my folder and looked at him directly for the first time without a question attached. We're coming to the end of our time. Is there anything you'd like to add about your candidacy that we haven't covered? He looked at me for a moment. Then he said something I hadn't expected. Not the professional close I'd been anticipating, not I'm excited about the opportunity or I believe I can add significant value. He said, I think I owe you an apology. The room temperature shifted. Diane looked at her notepad. Marcus studied the window. I kept my expression exactly where it was. Mr. Carr, I said, we're in a professional setting. Anything outside the scope of this interview isn't something I need or want to address here. I understand, he said. I wanted to say it. I heard you, I said. Then I stood up, and that was the end of the interview. We shook hands. His grip was firm. Mine was firmer. He thanked Marcus and Diane, gathered his portfolio, and walked out. Priya appeared at the glass door 30 seconds later to escort him to the elevator. I watched him walk down the hall. He didn't look back. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. After the door closed, Marcus turned to me and said, "Old acquaintance?" "Yes," I said. "Does it affect your assessment?" he asked. "No," I said. "My assessment is that he's a capable operational manager in a contraction phase, with no experience outside a family-insulated environment, limited strategic range, and an upward deference pattern that's inconsistent with the autonomy this role requires. He's not the right candidate." Marcus nodded slowly. I came to the same conclusion. Diane looked between us. "So did I," she said. We spent 12 minutes debriefing and agreed unanimously. The recommendation going to the hiring committee would not include Daniel Carr. I typed the summary that afternoon, pulled 4 supporting data points from the interview itself, 0 personal references, 0 borrowed leverage, and submitted it at 3:47. That evening I went to my gym, ran 4 miles on the treadmill, made pasta at home, and fed my cat. That was my day. The next morning, I received an email. It came at 7:52 from an address I didn't recognize, car58@gmail.com. The subject line was Daniel, interview at Callaway. I knew before I opened it. Richard Carr, 62, Daniel's father. I had met him twice during the engagement. A tall, deliberate man who reminded me of a building, solid, unreadable, slightly imposing. The email was 3 paragraphs. The first was a greeting. The second expressed that he hoped the interview had gone well and that he was confident his son had represented himself ably. The third said that he had worked alongside Thomas Whitfield on a fundraiser for the Hartford Business Association 4 years ago and that he was sure Thomas would vouch for Daniel's character should that be relevant to the decision. It was not subtle. It was not meant to be. It was a reminder that Daniel Carr came with a network, and that network had reach, and that I should be aware of that when making my recommendation. I read it twice. Forwarded it to Marcus with a single line, for documentation purposes. Then I went back to work. I heard from Thomas Whitfield by phone at 10:15. He was gracious about it, which was the Callaway way. He mentioned that Richard Carr had reached out, that he thought Daniel was a strong candidate, that he wondered if there were any outstanding questions he could help address. I told him the evaluation was complete and that the recommendation had been submitted. I thanked him for his interest. "Of course," he said. "I understand. And then, because Thomas Whitfield was fundamentally a fair man, I appreciate how you're handling this, Nadia." He didn't specify what this meant. He didn't need to. The hiring committee met on the following Tuesday. Our final recommendation went to a woman named Soren Hartley, 39, former head of operations at a regional healthcare network, track record in growth environments, clean decision-making framework, no deference pattern. She accepted the offer on a Thursday. By the following Monday, I had moved on to 3 other open roles. Daniel Carr had been part of my professional week the way any candidate was: a file, a decision, an outcome, a closed folder. What I had not anticipated was the call I received on a Thursday evening, 9 days after the interview. My phone showed an unknown number with a Connecticut area code. I almost didn't pick up. Something made me. "Nadia." The voice was low, measured, slightly careful. "Daniel." I sat down on my couch. My cat jumped up beside me and settled in. I got the decision, he said. I understand. A pause. I wanted to call you. Why? I asked. Not coldly. Genuinely. Because I needed you to know, he said, that I'm not calling to contest anything. Or to ask you to change it. Okay, I said. He stopped. Started again. I've thought about the parking lot a lot. In the last 7 years. More than you'd probably believe. I didn't say anything. The cat adjusted herself against my leg. Outside my window, a car passed on the street below, and I watched the headlights move across the ceiling. My mother was very clear with me, he said. About what she thought. About what she wanted. And I listened to her instead of what I actually wanted. Past tense. What he actually wanted. 7 years late and a parking lot too short. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Not angry, not wounded. Honestly curious. Because it was a real question. Because I think I owe you more than what I said in the conference room. You handled that interview with more professionalism than I deserved. And I wanted to say that out loud, not in front of anyone who might make it about something other than what it is. I sat with that for a moment. Thank you, I said. I mean that. Another pause. Longer this time. How are you? He asked. And the question was so simple, and so genuinely meant, that I almost laughed. I'm well, I said. I'm really well, Daniel. I heard something relax in his breathing. Good, he said quietly. You deserve to be. We stayed on the line for 3 more seconds. Neither of us said anything else. Then I said, good luck with what comes next. He said, same to you. And that was it. The line went quiet. I set my phone on the cushion beside me and looked at it for a moment. My cat stepped across my lap, turned twice, and settled down with her chin on my knee. What came next for Daniel Carr, I found out through professional channels over the following months rather than any active tracking. Carr Logistics completed a merger with a regional competitor in the fall, a deal that had been in motion for some time, which explained the contraction I'd seen in the resume numbers. The merger meant a structural reorganization. Daniel's VP role was absorbed into the new combined entity under different leadership. He was, by all accounts, handled fairly in the transition. He resurfaced 8 months later as head of operations at a smaller technology distribution firm, regional, stable, the right size for what he actually was rather than the size he had been reaching for. It was, I thought when I saw it on LinkedIn, the right landing. Not a diminishment, not a punishment. Just a more honest fit. Patricia Carr I heard about through a mutual acquaintance, a woman named Gloria who had done some event planning for a Hartford charity that both Patricia and my mother had been tangentially involved with. Patricia had, apparently, been increasingly socially diminished following the revelation, first circulated at a Hartford charity luncheon and then quietly confirmed by several sources, that Carr Logistics had been bleeding for 3 years and that the highly strategic merger had been, in less polished language, a rescue. The reputation she had maintained for decades as a woman of stable Westport prosperity had taken a quiet, precise hit from which, by all accounts, it had not fully recovered. I did not feel satisfaction when I heard this. I felt something more neutral and more complete than satisfaction. I felt the specific peace that comes when a story reaches its accurate ending. Courtney, Daniel's wife, she kept that name in all the professional directories I occasionally glimpsed, had returned to practicing law the previous year after several years out. This I noted without any particular feeling except something adjacent to respect. She had made her own choices, none of which had anything to do with me, and whatever her life looked like now was hers. There was a child, a daughter, 3 years old. I saw a photo once on a mutual connections page, Daniel at a beach somewhere, holding a small person in a yellow sun hat. He looked happy. I was glad he looked happy. That might sound impossible, and I've had to examine it carefully in therapy to make sure it was genuine rather than performed. It was genuine. What I had once felt for Daniel Carr had been real, and real things leave real marks, and I had done years of work on those marks, in Dr. Cole's office in Bridgeport, and later with a therapist in Hartford, and eventually on my own as the distance grew wide enough that the shape of the wound became visible rather than just the pain of it. What I saw, from that distance, was that Daniel had loved me in the way he was capable of loving, and that his capacity had been formed by a woman who had taught him, from the very beginning, that love was conditional on compliance. Patricia had made him small in the exact shape that would hurt me most. And he had let her. Not because he was a bad person. Because he was a limited one. And I had spent 2 years trying to love him past his limits and 6 months grieving the fact that I couldn't. The parking lot had been the end of that. The conference room had been the confirmation of what I'd already known since the first appointment with Dr. Cole. What he had done to me had shaped me in ways I was still discovering, and none of those ways were diminishments. They were refinements. They were the specific pressure that turned something ordinary into something with edges. 9 days after Daniel's phone call, I got an email from Carolyn Prest, a senior partner at Whitmore & Associates, one of the 3 firms in our industry that I considered genuinely elite. She was building a new leadership team around a practice director role. She had heard about my work from Marcus Webb, who had, apparently, mentioned my name in a conversation at an industry event without my knowledge and without any prompting from me. She wanted to know if I would be open to a conversation. I sat at my kitchen table with a mug of coffee that morning and read the email 3 times. Then I called my mother. "May," I said, "something happened." She listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which was how she listened to everything important. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You worked for this," she said finally. "Every part of it." "I know," I said. "But it still feels like a surprise?" "Yes." She made the small sound she made when she was smiling on the phone. "That's because you always forget to count what you build while you're building it." "I never forget. I've been counting since you were 25. I set the mug down and looked out my window. The street below was ordinary, a dry cleaner, a corner bodega, a bus stop with a bench that had seen better days. I had lived in this neighborhood for 4 years and I loved it with a specific, rooted love. "I'm going to take the meeting," I said. "Good," my mother said. "Wear the gray blazer." I wore the gray blazer. The meeting with Carolyn Prest lasted 90 minutes, which was 30 longer than scheduled, which in my experience means one of 2 things: either the conversation is going badly and someone is trying to rescue it, or it's going well enough that no one wants to be the one to end it. This was the second kind. Carolyn was 51, direct in the way that only people who have stopped needing approval can afford to be, and she had built the people operations practice at Whitmore from 4 people to 42 over a decade. She asked me questions I hadn't been asked in an interview before, not about my metrics, though she knew them, but about my philosophy. About what I believed talent acquisition was actually for. About the worst hiring decision I'd ever been part of and what I had learned from it. About what I thought most firms got wrong about the relationship between organizational culture and individual performance. I talked for a long time. She listened the way serious people listen, not waiting for her turn but actually taking things in, turning them over, asking the follow-up that proved she'd heard the first answer. At the end of the 90 minutes, she leaned back and said, "I've spoken to 4 candidates for this role. You're the one I want to think with, not just hire." I took the train home that evening instead of calling a car, which I almost never do, because I wanted the 40 minutes of movement and city noise and the specific anonymity of being a person on a train in a gray blazer who had just had the best professional conversation of her life and wanted to sit inside it for a while before it became a decision. The offer came 8 days later. Practice Director of Talent Strategy, Whitmore & Associates. A title that meant I would not just be filling roles but building the architecture that determined how the firm thought about people at every level. The salary represented a 31% increase over my current compensation. The equity component was something I had to read 3 times and then call my financial advisor about before I believed it. I accepted on a Wednesday morning, sitting at my kitchen table in the same spot where I had read Carolyn's first email, with the same mug of coffee and the same view of the street below. My cat was on the counter. The dry cleaner across the street was just opening its gate. The bus stop bench was still there, still holding its particular dignity. I typed my acceptance, sent it, and then sat quietly for a moment with my hands in my lap. I thought about my mother standing in the third row of my MBA graduation in a blue dress, crying. I thought about Dr. Cole's office in Bridgeport and the specific Tuesday morning when I had said out loud for the first time that I was not broken, I was clarified, and Dr. Cole had said, "Write that down. Put it somewhere you can see it." I thought about a parking lot in Simsbury on a Friday evening in October, and a gray sport coat, and hands in pockets. I thought about the way certainty had looked on a man's face in the moment before he chose his mother over me, and the way it had felt, and the specific quality of the silence on the drive home. And I thought about what it had taken, every year of work, every early morning and late email and careful decision, to turn that silence into something I could sit inside without flinching. The cat knocked a pen off the counter. I laughed. Then I called my mother. The conversation with Nadia Voss lasted 47 minutes and covered, in roughly this order, the title, the salary, the equity, whether Whitmore had good benefits, whether Carolyn seemed trustworthy, whether the office was near public transit, what I was going to eat for dinner, and whether I had been getting enough sleep. At the 30-minute mark, my mother said, "You know what your father missing means?" I hadn't expected her to bring him up. She rarely did. "What?" I asked. "It means you did all of this without anyone handing you a step. Every single step you made." She wasn't talking about my father leaving as a tragedy. She was talking about it as a data point, evidence that the architecture of my life had been self-built, load-bearing, mine. I pressed the phone against my ear and looked at the ceiling. "I had you," I said. "You did," she agreed. "But I'm your mother. I'm supposed to be there. I'm talking about the rest of it. The career, the degree, the choices. Nobody gave you those. You went and got them." I didn't say anything. Some truths are too full to talk around. "He was foolish," she said then, and I knew exactly who she meant. "And she raised him to be." "I know," I said. "But I'm grateful." "For what?" "For the parking lot," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I will keep, "That's what strength sounds like." We stayed on the phone for another 17 minutes talking about her garden and a neighbor dispute and a documentary she'd been watching. Ordinary things. The best kind. I gave my notice at Callaway Partners on a Friday. Marcus received it with genuine warmth and a handshake that lasted a beat longer than professional. "We're losing one of the best I've worked with," he said. "Don't be gracious," I told him. "Be specific." He laughed. "Specific, you are the most rigorous talent evaluator I have ever seen, and you do it without letting ego touch the process. That's rare." I thanked him and meant it. Priya cried, which I had expected, and made me promise to give her a reference, which I had already planned. I spent my final 2 weeks at Callaway completing handoffs, documenting processes, and having the kind of transition conversations that leave a place better than you found it. Not out of sentiment, out of standard. That had always been my standard. My first 90 days at Whitmore were the most intellectually demanding of my career. Carolyn had not exaggerated the scope. I was rebuilding a talent infrastructure for a 57-person firm while simultaneously handling 3 senior-level searches and developing a competency framework that hadn't existed before I arrived. I worked long hours and loved most of them, which is the only honest way to describe work that fits. There were hard weeks, weeks where the complexity felt more like weight than challenge, where I drove home in the dark and sat in my car for a few minutes before going inside. But there was something different about that particular tiredness from the kind I'd known before. It was the tiredness of building, not the tiredness of proving. Those are different in the body. One depletes you. The other deposits something. In November, 5 months into the role, I was asked to present at a regional HR leadership conference in Boston, a keynote on talent strategy and organizational identity. 45 minutes, 300 attendees, industry professionals from across New England. I prepared for 3 weeks. I stood at the podium on a Friday morning in a room that smelled like hotel carpet and fresh coffee, looked out at 300 faces, and spoke for 48 minutes without notes. Not because I had memorized the presentation, but because I had been living the material for 9 years and it had become indistinguishable from the way I thought. Afterward, 7 people stopped me in the corridor. Business cards, LinkedIn requests, 2 invitations to speak at future events. Carolyn, who had been sitting in the 3rd row, she had a thing for 3rd rows, I realized later, found me by the coffee station and said 2 words, "You're ready." I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't need to. The last thing I want to tell you is something that happened on a Saturday in December, for weeks before I'm sitting here talking to you. I drove to Bridgeport to see my mother. Nothing special, a Saturday visit, groceries, lunch at the kitchen table that had been in the same position since I was 7 years old. We made arroz con pollo. She told me about the neighbor's dog. I fixed a hinge on her cabinet door that had been loose for 2 months. After lunch, she brought out a box I hadn't seen before. A shoebox, actually, with a rubber band around it. She set it on the table between us. "I've been saving things," she said. I opened it. Inside was every piece of evidence of my life that she had kept without telling me. My MBA graduation program, folded carefully. A printout of an article in the regional business section about Callaway Partners talent expansion, my name mentioned in the 4th paragraph. A letter I had written her when I was 25 and newly promoted, full of the specific excitement of someone who had just started to believe their own potential. A photograph I didn't recognize at first, then I did. It was from the regional HR conference in Boston. Someone had taken a photo of me at the podium and it had ended up online, and my mother had found it and printed it on regular printer paper and put it in a shoebox. I was standing at the podium in the navy dress I'd worn. I was mid-sentence. My hands were open, not gripping anything. I looked, from the outside, like someone who had never been afraid. I know differently. I know every version of afraid I had been on the road to that podium. The parking lot in Simsbury. The bathroom floor in my apartment. The Tuesday mornings in Dr. Cole's office. The GMAT prep book stacked on my nightstand at 11 p.m. The calls on my lunch break. The early mornings. All of it. But from the outside, standing at that podium, I looked like someone who had always known exactly where she was going. And maybe that's the truest version of a thing, not the internal experience of arriving, but the fact that you arrived. The box held 12 items. My mother had been collecting me for 9 years without a word. I looked at her across the kitchen table. She shrugged in the particular way she had, one shoulder, a small lift, as if to say, of course, what else would I do? I put everything back in the box carefully, replaced the rubber band, and handed it back to her. "Keep it," I said. "I know where to come if I need to remember." She put the box on the counter beside the stove. We washed the dishes together without talking. That was the whole story. That was all of it. People ask me sometimes, when they learn parts of what happened, whether I regret that the conference room didn't involve more drama. Whether I wish I had said something in those 60 minutes that landed harder, cut deeper, stayed with him longer. The answer is no. And I want to be honest about why, because it matters. The conference room was not the point of the story. It was a data point. What Daniel Carr encountered that Thursday morning in March was not the woman he had left in a parking lot in 2017. He encountered the director she had become, the one who had built her rigor, her clarity, and her career out of the specific material of every hard year that followed that parking lot. That was the confrontation. Not anything I said. Just the fact of who I was sitting across that table. Composure is not distance. It is the evidence of work. And the work had been done, every day, for 7 years. I do not know if Daniel Carr thinks about the conference room. I do not know if it changed anything for him, or whether the phone call was a genuine reckoning or just a release valve. I know that it was real when it happened, and that his apology, late and partial as it was, confirmed something I had already proven to myself, that the damage he had done was not permanent. That I had taken a wound and turned it into architecture. That the woman who stood at a podium in Boston in November was the most honest version of the girl who had stood on a parking lot in October, because she had stopped standing still and started building. That is the only vindication I needed. Not his apology. Not the closed folder. Not the job that went to someone more qualified. Just the life, this specific, earned, mind-shaped life, that would not exist if he had chosen me. I know that sounds like a hard thing to mean and an easy thing to say. I mean it completely. My name is Nadia Voss. I am 34 years old. I am the practice director of talent strategy at Whitmore & Associates. I live in Hartford, in an apartment with morning light and a cat who has no respect for my work schedule. My mother calls on Sundays. I see her most months. I am in therapy every 2 weeks, not because I am broken, but because the examined life requires maintenance the way any structure does. I have work that fits the shape of how I think. I have a grandmother who taught me that roots are not the same as chains. I have a best friend who told me I was going to be okay before I believed it myself. And I have a shoebox in my mother's kitchen in Bridgeport with 12 things in it that prove, in paper and ink, that I was always building something, even when I couldn't see the shape of it yet. He did not choose me. And I have not spent one day in the 7 years since wishing he had. That is not bitterness. That is the cleanest truth I know. You do not need someone to choose you in order to build the life that proves the choice was theirs to lose. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.